Well, welcome everyone to my talk on a group of hat makers that made their home in medieval London. I have some pretty pictures to show you, and I hope to keep it lively and interesting. It's really rather a miracle, it seems to me, that this manuscript has never been edited. I learned about this manuscript from Milan Pajic, who said, "Oh, you should have a look at this," and I'm very glad he did. Milan's work on Flemish migrants in London will be known to you, and if it isn't known, I really recommend it. His book on this topic is coming out with Cambridge University Press. And then I should also thank Tracy Hill at Bath Spa University. She took photographs of this manuscript. You're looking at one of these photographs now. And before I was able to see it myself, I worked from these photographs. And the final person I'd like to mention, who's also here, is Shannon McSheffrey, because this has become a little bit of an obsession now, this group of hat makers and this strange manuscript, and I'm editing the text in it, but I'm also working with Shannon McSheffrey, who is actually the real historical expert, and I'm really rather a fraud giving a historical paper when my area of expertise is languages and literatures. Let me move on to the next slide, because I should also then mention the funder, the Leveson Trust, because this is part of a larger project. And this group is, of course, interested in relations between the Low Countries and England. And I should mention also that we're going to be, I offered Lisbeth, in fact, two papers. One was a paper on the Dutch hat makers, but the other paper I offered was one on sort of pictures of an exhibition, a preview of an exhibition which is opening in the Bodley on the 3rd of December. And there is an exhibition book about this topic too, North Sea Crossings, which I co-wrote with Sjoerd Leveson, who I think is also here. So this community of hat makers and this manuscript, what is so special about it? It's a matter of both contents and form. In terms of content, this manuscript contains the ordinances of the Fraternity of St. James. That's what they called themselves. This was, to use the medieval term, an alien fraternity. They were Dutch speakers. And I include, by the way, whenever I say Dutch, I really mean Dutch speaking, and I include under the heading of Dutch Flemish. I hope not to upset any Belgians here by referring to their language also as Dutch. This group of men, only brothers are mentioned, they clubbed together and they met in Blackfriars in London. And what the ordinances do is they give us the rules and regulations of this community. And these are very unique. Certainly, there are other alien fraternities and some of their ordinances survive. But as Shannon McSheffrey has pointed out to me, it's very important to note that these were not craft associations, but religious fraternities. Justin Colson has edited the ordinances of these alien fraternities, but he seems not to have known of the Dutch hat makers. And these Dutch hat makers organized themselves not just as a religious and social club, though they certainly did that too. And many of the rules are about how they ought to behave. One of the more interesting ones I'll just show you very briefly here in English. This is a list of fines that are payable if you hurt any of the other brothers of the fraternity. The fines increase depending on how much harm you inflict on them, which gives us some idea of the kinds of things that must have gone on in this fraternity. If you draw a weapon, you get fined so and so much. If you hit someone with stones, with loaves, with pots, with dish or candlesticks, you pay more. If you shed any blood, you pay still more, and so on. And if you kill someone, you're expelled forever. So very lively, some of these rules and regulations. These are the social regulations, but they did actually think of themselves as a professional body, as is clear from the following slide, which I'll just read out, because of course, once the names get mentioned, you get a personal interest. And then I have to say, these have become my friends. These guys, they were all Dutch, and I find myself in the same situation as them, being a migrant worker, as it were, in the UK, and I think just having the names there gives kind of personal element. So here they are. These are the four masters. These are the only people who are named. Of course, the fraternity was much larger. Named in the statutes, that is. We do actually have some of their names because some of these guys appear in other documents. It is established and ordained by the four masters: Andrew Morter, James Leese, Bartholomew Brink, Harry Graham, and also by the whole brotherhood of St. James in London, of the friars preachers there, in the year of our Lord, 1501, that every servant of that occupation of hat making, that maketh and flusheth hatters, shall wash them and make them clean, ready to the sale. Editing these things poses its own problems, because you do come across interesting words that don't appear in any dictionaries. And I draw your attention to the word, actually need help really with the word flusheth hatters. He that maketh or flusheth hatters. This word also occurs in the Dutch in the form flossen, and I have no idea what it means. And I've just given you in question marks a hypothesis. Does it mean lines with fine linen? Is this the verb that the Oxford English Dictionary puts under flax with the first attestation of 1848? It's full of linguistic interest, spellings and so on that don't occur anywhere else. I've given you one there, brederhoorde, brotherhood. That's not a spelling that is found anywhere in the Middle English Dictionary or the Old English, the Oxford English Dictionary. The names I've mentioned there, and it's possible, thanks to a wonderful website there. This is the database of Dutch surnames. The database of Dutch family names. Have a go. It's a lovely tool. Our guys, I think, were all, certainly three of them were Dutch. Brink. Well, I mean, that's a name. Bart Brink, Bartholomew Brink. That name is found, there's a long pedigree. There is a Henrik Brink in Drenthe in 1450, an Ameltink Brink in Harderwijk in 1461. Gram, that name has to be Dutch. It means, of course, angry. And there is a Johannes Dictum Gram in Simpelveld in Limburg in 1330. Lees sounds more plausible, doesn't it? The name James Lees. But Lees in Dutch was a first name. It was basically based on the name Laurentius, and it's first documented in Leeuwarden in 1540. Andrew Morter is the only guy who sounds totally Dutch. I cannot find the surname Morter really as an English name, but behind that name probably lurks a Belgian man, André Mortier. The common surname in the Low Countries from the 13th century onwards. So the survival of these bylaws of an alien craft is really an anomaly. What I think we have to remember is that the guilds were on the whole designed precisely to exclude aliens who were barred from becoming citizens of London and full members of the city's guilds. And this made it very difficult for migrants to practice their craft, since guilds, in theory, controlled production and retail of artisan products in the city of London. And the tendency of the guilds, the London guilds, but guilds everywhere, was to be rather exclusive about who was allowed to practice their craft. So the London hatters, who were incorporated in 1347, had this in their statutes, that no one shall make or sell, the original is an Anglo-Norman, that no one shall make or sell any manner of hats within the franchise of the city aforesaid, if they be not free of the same city, unless they are free men of the same city, on pain of forfeiting to the chamber the hats which he shall have made and offered for sale. So it made it tough for migrant workers. And the existence of these exclusionary politics and legislation is probably one of the main factors that drove the Dutch hat makers to organize themselves as a unit, as a society, and to convene in a place, Blackfriars in London. I've circled it with red there. You can actually see it's marked there as well. On the River Thames, there's the letters Blackfriars. And they organized themselves there probably because it was outside the jurisdiction of the City of London. These were liberties that were outside of the jurisdiction of the City of London. The other factors that probably are relevant if we want to explain why these Dutch hat makers allied themselves with the Dominicans of Blackfriars are probably linguistic and cultural. It's important to remember that the friars had been immigrants into England themselves. And certainly the pattern in the medieval period is that more than the secular clergy, the friars understood the importance of understanding and speaking the vernaculars, the vernacular languages of the city dwellers that they served, and of course the city dwellers that also served them. So it's not a coincidence that other alien fraternities whose statute survives are also met in friaries. Blackfriars was also favored by the French fraternity of the Immaculate Conception and the Dutch fraternity of the Holy Trinity, for which we do not have statutes. And of course, it's worth remembering also that the church that the Dutch speakers adopted before and after the Reformation as their church was another friary. It was Austin Friars. Now, interesting to think what circumstances brought these hat makers over. And the truth of the matter is it's probably quite varied because they actually, as we shall see, they came from different parts of the Low Countries and they will have had different motivations. We do know that there were opportunities for enterprise and craftsmen in later medieval London. A very important pull factor was the labor shortages caused by successive waves of the Black Death led to higher wages. And this in turn led to the emergence of what Mark Ormrod, Butt, Lambert, and Jonathan Macman in their wonderful book, Immigrant England, describe as an emerging consumer market. And thus began a demand for fashion and novelty in clothing that meant that skilled craftsmen could do very well for themselves. There were also push factors that drove Dutch speakers across the North Sea to Britain. There was a series of floods in Holland, Zeeland, and Brabant in the early 15th century. There was political turmoil, including the revolt against Maximilian of Austria that broke out in 1483, and that led to a spike in migration numbers. Another factor that I will mention is that it's particularly relevant to hat makers, continental hat makers, is that legislation was being passed that made the manufacture of hats for the English market less lucrative than it had been before. These laws included forbidding rules forbidding imports. It seems to have largely failed, but occasionally, no doubt, shipments were refused. And then I should also mention that there was legislation in 1488 and 1489 setting maximum prices for hats. And this, of course, made it, the idea was that these were measures really designed to make the production of deluxe hats for the English market unprofitable. If all such a hat could fetch was 20 pence, you couldn't really do very well. So certainly it's the case that in hat making, craftsmen from the Low Countries had a special reputation. from the later 14th century, the cloth-making industry that fueled the urban economy of the Low Countries went into decline, partly because countries like England finally caught up and learned how to make their own cloth. This took a little while, but the urban cities of the Low Countries that had become prosperous through cloth making bounced back by supplying the demand for high-end luxury items, tailoring, accessories, illuminated manuscripts, and so on. And the first sign that English customers with money to spare look to the Low Countries for fine hats is the prologue to the Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, about 1390. And I've shown you here the merchant who, says Chaucer, wears a Flandrish beaver hat. So this merchant here is wearing a felt hat that he's bought in Flanders, and this was a hat made not from woven material, but from animal fur, and the best felt hats were made of beaver fur. If you want to see fine felt hats, the best place to look is the paintings of the Netherlandish painter active in the early 15th century, Jan van Eyck. I think this gives us a wonderful insight. This also shows you why these hats were fashionable. Just wide brims is what you wanted. It's a complete departure from what the English used to wear, which is sort of close-fitting caps. You wanted wide brims, and beaver fur was the way you could create this. Very imposing hats. This was painted in Bruges in I'm not sure, I think it's 1435 or 1434. Now there seems to be no inherent reasons why the English couldn't make hats of their own. Why couldn't they make felt hats? But the evidence strongly suggests that this art was plied by aliens, and that it took a little while for the technology to do it to be adopted in England. One tool that really advanced the production of, made it much easier to make fine felt hats, was the felt maker's bow. And I have here a picture which I owe to the Renaissance Skin project. And from that project, I've learned a little bit about how it works, this felt maker's bow. After you've plucked the rough guard hairs from the pelt of the beaver, you shave off the fine hair and you pile this on your work surface. Then you use your bow. It's really like a string. It's got like a bow of violin. It actually has a string, gut string. This string is taut, and with a wooden pin, which you see lying on the table, you get this string going. The string vibrates. It allows you to tease the beaver hairs, to mix and entangle it very easily. And it is then ready for the next stage, which I'll spare you because that involves steaming it in urine and so on. Now, according to the Renaissance Skin website, this instrument that you see here was introduced into England in the second half of the 16th century by Huguenot refugees. But I think the Renaissance Skin researchers are probably out by a century or more, because the technology can be traced in the iconography of the patron saint of our fraternity. Remember, our Dutch hat makers were called the Fraternity of St. James, or in Dutch, het Broederschap van Sinte Jacob. In later medieval iconography, St. James is initially presented from about the 14th century until about the end of the 14th century with a fuller's club. This is what you use to hit wool, and it looks a bit like a hockey club. There it is. You see it there on I see it on the left of my screen. I hope, but I'm not. What happens from the very end of the 14th century is that St. James starts being depicted with a different instrument altogether. I've got you a nice picture there, which is 1519, which shows this. Hopefully you can just still see the string there too. This is the felt maker's bow, and St. James. So the iconography of St. James undergoes a change. no longer a fuller's club, but from the very late 14th century onwards, first in Augsburg, apparently. My great guide is Richard Bedford, whose book is called St. James the Less, a study in Christian iconography. This has been my guide in this area, and he claims that the first representation of St. James with a feltmaker's bow rather than a fuller's club is late 14th century. But then about a century later, it can be found in Exeter in the 1480s for the first time. This is the west front of Exeter Cathedral. Very hard to see. So I've also given you the little drawing that Bedford made of it. And you will see in St. James's right hand, he seems to be leaning on it. His right hand, you'll find there the feltmaker's bow. Some more examples, because they make pretty pictures. In the V&A, I find the following. There from 1510, there is this lovely little statue of St. James, found in England, but actually probably an import, and we deduce that from the spelling of the name Jacob with a C, probably a Flemish product, but imported into England 1510. And then the first actually London produced a little statue of St. James with the feltmaker's bow. There is in 1536. And these apostle spoons, they're lovely little spoons. Unfortunately, the picture that I have of them from the V&A, it is so small that you can barely see it. And I've resorted to a PDF from a book I found on this by Caldecott, which has a representation. You may have to trust me on it because it's still quite small, but there in red is St. James with the feltmaker's bow. And if you think, well, what does this have to do with the Fraternity of St. James? I just remind you that our Dutch fraternity had adopted St. James as their patron saint. And I think the reason for this will now be obvious, because these guys worked in felt. The demand for felt hats produced by the latest technology was met overwhelmingly in the 15th century by importing them, and the numbers really are quite staggering. And I cite Marie-Rose Tielemans, who picked out hats in particular in her study of the commercial relations between England and the Burgundian Low Countries. It's worth saying what she has to say. On reste d'ailleurs confondu devant l'ampleur de ce commerce. Il entra en port de Londres du 1er avril au 25 septembre 1450, 1450 that is, 71 070 chapeaux. I hate numbers in French. 71,070 hats imported. Now, these were not, of course, all felt hats, but about half of these were felt hats. What a lively trade in felt hats. We don't have to imagine this trade, because there's a poem that describes it for us, and the associations with the Low Countries, again, very, very strong. London Lickpenny is a poem written in the middle of the 15th century. It describes the adventures of a Kentish man who wants justice, and he travels up to London. He goes to Westminster hoping to have his case heard, but he discovers that you are no one in London without money, and he's thrown out of Westminster Hall. And as he leaves Westminster Hall, he is accosted there. Without the doors were a Flemings great warn. There was a great number of Flemings. Upon me fast they gan to cry, and said, "Master, what will ye kopen or be?" Kopen, well, that is our Dutch word for buy. even a bit of code switching into Dutch. Fien felt hats, spectacles for te reden. All these wonderful things that you can only buy if you have a lot of money. Spectacles and felt hats. I should notice, by the way, that none of the nice touches about kopen is not only is that an authentic Dutch word, the spelling is also authentically Flemish. The C spelling is what you expect in the southern Low Countries. In the north, they write with K, they spell that word with K. Spectacles and hats were imported into the Low Countries, though this is also the time when the first migrant craftsmen are recorded. This is true also for spectacles. The first London spectacle maker was a Dutchman. He lived in Southwark. His name was Paul van de Bessen. The first recorded felt hat makers active in London, more or less the time this poem was written, are not actually in London, but in York. They are actually described in the York records as felt hat makers. And here they are. Petrus Knif, Johannes Mogen, and Nicolaas Wilde. They were probably all Dutch speakers. Knijf, I've done some work on, that's a good Dutch surname. Mogen is found in the York archives in an entry certifying that John Mogen Dutchman is a freeman and denizen of the city. A word of warning, of course, with these words like Dutchman, this could describe someone from Germany too. But Nicolaas Wilde is probably the same man who received letters of denization in London in 1470, where he's said to have been born in Kampen, in the bishopric of Utrecht, and his profession is there described as a skinner. The statutes of the Fraternity of St. Catherine are, to my knowledge, the first solid evidence for the manufacture of felt hats in London. And the possibility that these Dutch guys were pioneers of a new industry is confirmed by what historians closer to the period than we are said. This is all I find about the beginnings of felt making in early historians. One is the evidence of Edmund Howes in his continuation of Stowe's Chronicle. He's writing in the 17th century, early 17th century, and he claims that about the beginning of Henry VIII, so that'll be about 1510, was begun the making of Spanish felts in England by Spaniards and Dutchmen. Before he's trying to think when this innovation in fashion started, and he dates that at the beginning of Henry VIII's reign. The other interesting bit of evidence is that the felt makers' journeymen kept records, and there are some records. These are 1810 that have the device of that depict the device of the felt makers' journeyman. This is a hatter who's traveling, and the document shows 2 dates around this device have been printed, which they obviously regarded as sort of the big years in their trade. Hats, first invented, 1456. First made in London, 1510. Obviously, these felt makers were talking of the hats that interested them most, and that was felt hats. So one thing that is remarkable about this manuscript is that they are the only surviving remains of an alien craft guild in medieval England. The other thing that is utterly unique is that it is a bilingual Middle English, Middle Dutch document, and to my knowledge, it's the earliest text that was drawn up in these 2 languages. The statutes contain 27 articles, with the exception of the last 3, which are in English only. They were all drawn up in English and Dutch. There's a Dutch version of every article following the English language version. This way of the organization is best seen by showing you a picture of the manuscript here. What you're seeing here is just a page from this manuscript. You've got the top 2 lines there, are the last two lines of an article that has been given in English. That's followed then by a translation of that same article in Dutch. I'll just read that for you. Item dat is verzameld en geordineerd, dat geen van derzelfde broederschap zullen verkopen, and so on. I shouldn't actually be reading this with a Belgian accent. I should be reading this with a Northern Dutch accent, because as we'll go on to see, this guy was from near Groningen, but I'm from Maastricht, so the Flemish is easier for me. And then below that bit of Dutch, you should see, although it's a little faded, there is another large capital that should be blue, and you find another statute, another article then in English, and below that again you'll find the translation of that same article in Dutch. Now, the surviving ordinances of it's sort of, well, I suppose when you see it like that, it looks quite normal, because we're quite used to seeing medieval manuscripts where you get nice alternation between little text blocks and marked with red Lombardic capitals followed by ones with blue Lombardic capitals, absolutely standard. But what we see here is actually rather unusual, because it's not normally two languages, English and Dutch, that are organized in this way. The surviving ordinances of English guilds are, as a rule, monolingual, usually English, but until the early 15th century also French. Sometimes they are bilingual. You can have things in Latin. Usually, in fact, quite often there's a little bit of there's a little preamble in Latin and a little postamble in Latin, often written by. These bits were often written by professional notaries who were basically officializing the statutes that they received from the guilds. It's interesting to consider the statutes of other alien confraternities and the languages that these are in. And the surviving statutes of these confraternities, there are three. There was the wonderful fraternity of the Holy Blood of Wilsnack in Saxony. These were probably German speakers. And they wrote their ordinances in English. There's a bit of Latin at the start, at the end, and at the start, which is by the professional notary who writes that bit. The Fraternity of the Immaculate Conception was a French outfit, and their ordinances are in French. The Fraternity of St. Catherine, well, that one we have to be very, very fond of them, of course, because they were also Dutch. And the closest thing we get to the closest parallel, really, to these bilingual English-Dutch ordinances is the Fraternity of St. Catherine. Unfortunately, the bit in Dutch hasn't survived, but it did once exist, because the person who wrote these, okay, so yeah, the whole document is in English. It was copied by Richard Bloodywell, Doctor of Law and Commissary of London. But for our purposes, the most interesting thing about the statutes of the Fraternity of St. Catherine is the thing that hasn't survived. Because in addition to the regulations in the English document, Richard Bloodywell writes that the brothers and sisters of the fraternities are bound to obey, and here I quote, all other ordinances, acts, constitutions, and rules made among the said brotherhood, specified and declared in Dutch tongue, whereof a copy in schedule to these presents is annexed. In other words, there was once an appendix to the English statutes. Although it's also clear that this Dutch schedule, this Dutch document wasn't a translation of the English, but an addition. Justin Colson assumes that because they were not translated, they had no legal value. But the commissary seems to have thought otherwise, because he goes on to ratify the fines stipulated in the Dutch document. And he further stipulates that half the amount of the fines to be levied when the rules in the Dutch document are broken are for the fraternity's own coffers, and the other half is for the building work at St. Paul's. So comparing the statutes of the Fraternity of St. James with those of others turns out to be really quite a unique document. It is certainly true that we have, from the 15th century, some other bilingual documents. These can be found in the Book of Privileges, which is in the Company of the Mercers. It's in the Mercers Archive. This contains a few Dutch grants and Dutch privileges granted to the merchant venturers. From the very late 15th century, one document is 1474, the other one is 1480. And these were furnished with translations in this particular manuscript, which is from 1485. The documents were issued, however, in Dutch, and they were then translated into English at some later stage. So it's rather a different case. And also the priority of the Dutch in these documents is very clear from the translation, which sticks so close to the Dutch that the English is often barely comprehensible without knowledge of Dutch. What we have in the statutes of the hatmakers is, I think, something very different. We are not dealing with a document that was originally written in one language and translated later, but rather with a document that was drawn up bilingually from the very start. Ian Archer, who is one of the few historians to have looked at the statutes of the Dutch hatmakers, claims that the English came first and that the ordinances were then translated into Dutch. But while the passages in English and Dutch do come in that order in the manuscript, so in the manuscript you get the English first and then the Dutch, neither looks to me like a translation of the other. Certainly there is evidence of interference between languages, but that influence runs in both directions. And I think if we just compare the languages, you will realize how independent of each other these versions actually are. I've just put one example up here. This is article number 19. I'll just read this in English. After all, I think linguistically this thing is really quite is of interest, and we can get a flavor of the document. First, the Middle English. Item, it is established and ordained that no brother of the said fraternity shall take no manner of man or put to his occupation of the said craft of hat-making. I've italicized certain words that are interesting. Without he be learned in the same fraternity, nor none other that cometh from any master of any other fraternity or fellowship, upon such pain as by the masters and the more part of the said brethren of the said fraternity shall be reasonably after their discretion limited and esteemed. That's the Middle English, and here comes the Dutch. Item, dat is verzameld en geordineerd dat geen broeder van derzelfde broederschap zal aannemen geen knecht, of de te werken zetten die met enige andere meester geleerd heeft, die in onze broederij niet is. Hij betalen de boete tot de meesters en de overzienders van dezelfde broederschap, als hij kan corderen met een vier meesteren die daartoe gezet zijn. I will give for those people who haven't got Dutch, a literal translation of the Dutch. It allows you to compare the Dutch with the English, and hopefully you get a sense of how different this is. Item, it is enjoined and ordained that no brother of the same brotherhood shall employ or put to work any servant who has been taught by another master who is not in our brotherhood, unless he pays such a fine to the masters and overseers as he can agree with the four masters appointed to this matter. So the English and the Dutch agree on the general sense, but neither version has served as the linguistic model for the other. And in fact, they differ on matters of detail, the kind of differences that you'd think would bother a lawyer. In the English, the penalty is to be decided by the masters and the majority of the membership. In the Dutch, the amount is to be decided by mutual agreement of the masters and supervisors and the offender. Now, linguistically full of interest, here is our first recorded attestation of the word hat making in English. OED has this only in 1547, so this is quite a bit earlier. A few bizarre things in the Dutch, which I've also put in italics, are bizarre. Actually, broederij, I mentioned, maybe my other Dutch speakers in this session can it sounds like a perfectly plausible word, doesn't it? Broederij, fraternity. But I haven't been able to find it in any dictionary. Verzamend, well, that word usually means to assemble, to unite, and I have not found that anywhere else in the sense of decreed or ordained. So there's much to be learned from this document. I've mentioned this whole problem with document. Whose language are we actually reading? Who wrote these statutes? Was this done by a professional London scribe, as sometimes happens, or do we assume that they were that it was the brothers of the fraternity themselves? They did have a clerk, I hasten to add, and it's very likely, I think, that the clerk that is mentioned in the document would be one of the people writing it. Writing adds another interesting dimension, because writing too is a cultural practice, and if we ask ourselves whether how well these guys were able to become part of English culture, one of the interesting things is looking at their writing. Now, we have two scribes in this document, and their handwriting is really very, very different. The first scribe, scribe 1, writes in a littera hybrida, as it's called, a hybrid between the looser cursive scripts and the formal bookhand, typical of the Low Countries. There really isn't any English influence in this hand. It's interesting to compare him with Scribe 2, who takes over, I think it's folio 11 that Scribe 2 takes over. You might think that if there were two scribes, one would write the English and one would write the Dutch, but that's not what happens. These scribes, Scribes 1 and Scribes 2, are both very competent writing English and Dutch. So Scribe 1 seems to me has learnt the art of writing on the continent, but I'd like you to have a look at the difference between Scribe 1 and Scribe 2. I've circled certain letters that are really very interesting, because it's very interesting to see Dutch, to me at least, Dutch written in an English style handwriting. This scribe has features of the Anglicana cursive handwriting, the writing style of England, and I've circled a few of these. That round S in line 3 for saint, that round S at the beginning of a word. The letter was also used on the continent, but not at the beginning of a word. That's a feature of Anglicana. Unlike Scribe 1, who has a single compartment G, this scribe has the double compartment Anglicana G. He has the R. You'll see it in the second paragraph there, broederschap, that R that goes down with the shoulder there, that Anglicana R. And I also draw your attention to the which, the W. Typical Anglicana W. Scribe 1 doesn't do this, but Scribe 2 does. That ends in a kind of 3. an Anglicana feature. So it seems to me that what we have here is a scribe 1, who I guess learned to write on the continent, and the scribe 2 is someone who actually learned to write in England. The fact that he knows Dutch so well, that's all sorts of possibilities. He may have been, I think he may have been, for example, second generation. The language is quite different too. Scribe 1 is from the northeast of Holland, and scribe 2 is from, I think he's from Flanders. And I've given on this slide some of the interesting linguistic differences. So scribe 1, it's very quite consistent. Scribe 1 writes K at the beginning of words. Scribe 2 writes C. Scribe 1 writes ambucht. Scribe 2 writes ambacht. Scribe 1 writes broder. Scribe 2 writes bruder. Scribe 1 writes initial and medial G. Scribe 2 writes initial and medial GH. Scribe 1 writes brengen. Scribe 2 writes bringen. Scribe 1 writes heiligen for holy. And scribe 2 writes heiligen. Scribe 1 writes derde, and scribe 2 writes darde. Well, there isn't much time for me to show you the wonderful things you can do with these kinds of details, because you can go through the Linguistic Atlas. I might just show you one of them there. This is the slide for broder and bruder. The dark bit there is where you say bruder with OE, and the white bit is where you say broder with an O. So this is the wonderful Vormen-Catalogus, the kind of dialect atlas, and you can map these features. And it's clear to me that scribe 1 is from the northeast of Holland. It's very clear from particularly from Heiligen, which is really quite restricted. The dark bits is where you find Heiligen, written with an I. You can see that that's really limited to that northeastern top of the Netherlands. So these scribes, and in turn I could conclude from that, I guess, that these scribes are not copying the language of someone else, that the Dutch that they write is actually a reflection of the Dutch that they would speak. I end finally with a little word about what happened to these haberdashers, what happened to this community. They got absorbed by the haberdashers in 1511, and the manuscript itself was taken over by the haberdashers. The final item in the manuscript is the oath of the wardens of the haberdashers, which of course would be of no interest really to these hat makers, but the circumstance of this guild merging with the haberdashers in 1511 is also the circumstance that probably explains why this document has survived in the first place, when the community whose purposes it initially served had disappeared. The documents ended up in the archive of the haberdashers, and it's because they ended up there that we still have this wonderful witness of a vanished past. High time I stop there, and I thank you all for your attention.
I see a lot of hand clapping and adding mine as well. Thank you so much for a really interesting paper, and like the layers of bilinguality, both the kind of the translation or not translation, but then also the hand and the different differences between those, and just the richness that you get from just what is not a huge manuscript, right? Where you get the really interesting texture of this very bilingual life in London. So that is very intriguing. I forgot to mention in opening that we are recording, and so I hope that people are not too upset about that who are joining here, but so just a warning that if you don't want to be seen, that you can turn off your video. but that we are now opening to questions. Questions can be ideally raise your hand with the raise your hand function, which is at the bottom on the reactions button, because I can't see all of you. So don't physically, even though I keep doing that myself, but so raise your hand via that function, or drop in the chat if you want to ask a question, but prefer not to vocalize it, and I can read it out myself. So anyone is very welcome to raise any questions and to then grab the microphone if I mention your name. Yes, you can also just put the word question in the chat. That also works. And I see that Bree has raised her hand. So over to you, Bree.
Hi, thank you so much. This was such an interesting paper, and I have so many questions, as I'm sure everyone else does. So one of the things that I was thinking out throughout this was my interest in confraternities is obviously in Arras. And the one that I have studied, we have statutes and we have a list of names, which is wonderful and exceptional. And I think one of the interesting things about that list of names is that it sort of betrays that while the statutes do talk a little bit about trade, the confraternity was open to anyone, that anyone in the city could actually join it. And I was wondering if you have any hints of how people can join, if they have to be hat makers, and if there's nothing in the statutes, if that might actually kind of answer the question about that bilinguality, because if they're admitting other people from London, then they might sort of have a bilingual membership. I'm not sure if that sort of is related to anything you looked at. Thanks.
Oh, that's fascinating. That's a really interesting question, though. And it's such a shame that we do not have the names apart from the four masters. There are names later on, because I mentioned the merger of them when the Haberdashers, and this wasn't altogether happy, and there were court cases and recriminations. And so we do have some names surfacing, and they are also all Dutch names. So probably they were all Dutch, I think. The interesting question you raised: were they all hat makers, or could there have been people, as it were, who joined for the social? Because it's a very mixed. It's really a kind of mixed fraternity. It's I would say about 75% of the content isn't really about trade at all. It's the usual social things that the guilds do, right? So that if someone dies, everyone must come to the funeral and wear the livery and that kind of stuff. And that's about 75% of it. And the other 25% really is about hat making, and they include things like what you say about how the kind of, one of the interesting things about the statutes, and as you might expect from a migrant community, it was very open to new members, and they must have had an influence. They always say, whether this person comes from this side of the sea or from the other side of the sea, and there are provisions about accepting masters from other, accepting brothers who have been trained by masters from abroad, and who need to demonstrate that they have been trained by these masters from abroad for 2 years before they can enter. So the statutes do give a sense of a kind of contacts, if you like, being maintained with the Low Countries. It does, I think, it does. It does seem to me that they were all hat makers, from what I can tell from the document. That that doesn't. I hope that answers it a little bit, your question. Thank you for it.
Yeah, thank you.
Super. There's another hand from Elsa.
Hoi. Ad, bedankt. Thank you very much. I love the detail of the paper. That's very you. And it's very, very interesting. This is a very idle thought. I found myself looking cursorily in the surface of a footnote at some town oorkonden, documents and ordinances, etc., in the time that the rhetoricians in the early 16th century fashioned a kind of universal literary language, which really stretches quite a long way from towns in the west of Flanders to towns in the east of Brabant and north as well. And what struck me in that was that the difference between looking into the kitchen of the urban communities, all the fine details, all the ordinances against, possibilities of fire hazards, etc., how different that is. So the rhetorician's language is already quite a stylized language, whereas all these different town ordinances are very definitely not stylized. And I found myself wondering, when you were puzzling over, the broderieën, etc., whether what we see there is a kind of remnant of dialectal features which individual people have brought from who knows where in the Low Countries. Is that a foolish thought?
No, this is absolutely true. And I'm glad you mentioned it, Elsa, because this is really the thing that makes, for anyone with linguistic interest, the document so I mean, anyone who's interested in Middle Dutch is going to find words in this. Like you mentioned that, a broederij, for instance, it's perfectly plausible. I do not think for a moment that it's because they didn't have any, that their Dutch was disappearing or anything. Because
no.
Absolutely fine. But the other thing, what you say is interesting there, that I find myself thinking that it's harder, I think, in medieval Dutch for people working in medieval Dutch to I don't think we are as well served by dictionaries. The dictionary of the Middle Nederlands Woordenboek is so patchy.
Yeah, well, there's an awful lot of it.
Yeah, but I mean, how, where are these? Yeah, but as you say, what we're dealing with is a person writing in the dialect, in his case, of somewhere near Groningen, right? He's writing.
Yeah, that is true. Yeah.
And that language is not always what people have been interested in, because dictionaries, on the whole, is true for OED too. There are plenty of words, or English words too, that aren't in this, that aren't recorded. I've mentioned hat making, for instance, completely, and that is again because I don't suppose they're as interested in these kinds of documents. They're more interested in literature, aren't they?
Yeah. As an adopted fake Groninger myself, I nevertheless have to concede that there may not have been many people around Groningen who did write at that time. So the source material may be a little thin on the ground.
Oh, well, that makes it even more interesting, yeah.
Building on that question of the variety, Sjoerd was wondering, it was very intrigued how much this confraternity is bringing together Dutch speakers from distinct locations in the Low Countries, and was wondering if there's an indication if other fraternities, including Dutch speakers, would be similarly geographically diverse in terms of their origins in the Low Countries, or if that is specific to this confraternity. And that in other places you might have a concentration of Flemings or something.
Yeah. No, it's a very good question. It would need more research. I was a bit surprised as well, really. The kind of stuff that the name suggests that they might be from different places is actually also then shown by the dialects, and it's such and what Sjoerd says, they're from such different parts of the Low Countries that we now think, well, these are different political entities, even, aren't they? Flanders, Yeah, it's very, very. There is, if you were going to research it, I think the Fraternity of Saint Catherine does have all names. It lists all names of the Brotherhood, not just the masters. So if you could do some work on these, on the family names, and work out from that way, work out that way if this was true for that particular Dutch-speaking confraternity. It's a good question, but I don't have the answer.
It is fascinating that is the kind of bringing together of, as you say, political different entities in under one hat. I see other hands. So Thea is the first one in my list.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry. Thank you, Al. As someone with a slightly vested interest in the North Sea Crossing project, I was struck by the fact that on the dialect maps, all the people who of whom you trace ancestry or movement across the North Sea are from the west and from Groningen, so they're all near the sea. There's nobody there. Have you found people from Utrecht or somewhere else, landlocked areas?
Yeah, I have found them. Yeah, nice to hear you, Thea. Thea is translating North Sea Crossings into Dutch, so there will be a Dutch translation of it. Thank you, Thea.
Yeah.
Yeah, the guy Nicolaas Wilde that I mentioned as being one of the earliest felt hat makers, shown in first found in York in the 1460s, later signs a letter of denization where he declares that he is from the bishopric of Utrecht.
All right.
But you're probably right that they're probably more. But the thing is, everything's really quite close to the sea, isn't it? You know, in the Low Countries.
In a way.
Yes, in a way. Yeah.
But then, I mean, it's more difficult then to get to the coast.
It was, and what you say is probably true. That they're more likely, I think, to be from the coastal areas. The guy I mentioned as Scribe 2 has features in his dialect. He says instead of derde, he says darde.
Yeah.
He writes G instead of NG after I, and those features. I am reliably informed by Louis in his book Nederlandse Sprakens, come from the coastal area of Flanders, not even just Flanders, but actually
the coastal.
Definitely coastal features.
Okay. Well, thank you anyway. It's most interesting.
It reminds me of the kind of the early element of what Renaud Morieux talks about, like a channel community for fishers in both England and France, where it's those coastal villages that are really connected because of the channel, and it is because they are at the coast, and that's just the easy transit element, and through their shared profession. I see a hand by Milpa is on the screen, but I don't know.
It's Milan actually.
Okay.
I don't know why it is written. It's Milan Page, but I don't know why it actually came out as Milpa. But okay. Hi, Ad. Thank you very much.
Nice
Good
to see you.
I don't really have a question, so I'm sorry actually to jump in like this. I just want to answer and give you a suggestion. So this is a little bit of an answer to Schuurt's question. So let's call it quite known example is of the Dutch, the weavers from the Low Countries in the 14th century. When they arrive in the mid 14th century, they are all together, both those from Flanders and from Brabant. and also probably they are accepting those from Holland who arrived, or from Zealand. When the Brabantine community becomes a little bit larger, so 15 years after the creation of the Weavers Guild in the 14th century, they want to separate. So they kind of invent that they can't, there is like a big brawls between them if they are together. And so they officially ask from the London authorities a separation, and it is granted. And then afterwards there are two different, so there is a Brabantine Guild, and then there is a Flemish Guild of Weavers. Another example that I would give you is from Florence, where also documents are survive in both Dutch, Italian, and Latin, I think. And it is also of the textile workers. This one is very interesting because they are accepting, so the guild is formed and the fraternity is formed from those from Holland, Flanders, Brabant, and from Holy Roman Empire, so from the principalities of Germany as well. But the Italians, of course, they call it all Tedeschi. But then when you look at the names, like people come from Utrecht, from Bruges, so it's not really Tedeschi. But so these are kind of the examples that you can also think about to include following question from Sjord.
Oh, yeah. That's wonderful. Particularly interesting what you say there about this trilingual document there from Italy. Did you say Dutch, Italian?
Dutch and Latin, I'm sure. And for the third one, I can't remember.
Well, fascinating.
It is it survives, so it only is concerned with the textile workers, and different parts of the document survive from like beginning of the 15th century, and it goes into the 16th century, and it contains a lot of names and everything. So
that would be a wonderful thing. Well, I'll follow that up with you, Milan. Certainly.
Yeah, no worries, no worries.
And I mean, the other thing that you mentioned there was quite interesting. Obviously, which might have a bearing on what you suggested is that when numbers permit, as it were, you might see more. You might see associations based on I come from Brabant, you come from Flanders, and so on. But so that's an interesting, because one of the questions, of course, I've asked myself is how many people belong to this particular fraternity. I don't have the answers.
Yeah, that is always the question, because for the textile workers, usually the people that are mentioned are those who are kind of the guarantees for the enforcement of articles. So yeah, it's very difficult to determine how many of them were there. I think even for the natives, if there are guilds, usually you never know, because matriculation lists, they are never complete. So yeah. But was just another, I will use the opportunity just to ask, and but was the England's Immigrants website helpful? The database?
Yeah, I used it all the time. For example, the Nicolaus Wilder is in there, and I've also done, one of the nice things you can do is you can search by profession. So I did actually use the search engine on all migrants, and I filtered them by profession, hatter or hat maker, and that does allow you to see that really there were a lot of Dutch or Teutonic hat makers. So it was very valuable, wonderful website.
Yeah, good. Thank you very much again, and speak to you soon.
like the numbers, they were intriguing me as well. But so now knowing that that's not an option. But I'm gonna hand over to the next question asker soon. But just when you've gone through that database, like, are most of the hat makers Dutch and German, and are most of the Dutch people somehow connected with these kind of practices? Do you see any
the French
overlap with
mustn't forget the French. The French were also big hat makers, but probably the majority are Dutch. Yeah.
Intriguing. Right. Elizabeth, you've had your hand up.
Thank you. My question is actually related. I was also struck by some of these numbers, particularly the 71,070 hats crossing. I'm curious how this compares to other goods being traded at the time. I just don't know that much about the period. Was this large enough that the guild would have been particularly powerful?
Of course, the guild must have felt, the guild must have had an ambivalent, and certainly one of the nice little ironies that certainly for imports, this was high. The book I'm relying on is this, it was in my slide, Tielemans, have I got the name right? I think people will correct me if I'm wrong, Tielemans. Book about the relationships between, it's in French, Angleterre et Bourgogne. And that particularly singles out hats, actually. It has, it really, of course, these weren't the only goods that were traded, many other stuff, of course, including books, came across. But hats really was a big thing. And I think it's partly the reason that was so big is that there wasn't at this stage in the dates for the imports of 70,000 hats was 1 year in 1450. The reason that was so high is that there wasn't really an English, there weren't English producers. So I think what happens when these Dutch hat makers start producing hats, felt hats in England, they suddenly, of course, start thinking of these imports, the stuff they used to do themselves, no doubt, before they went over to England, as stuff they don't want. And one of the nice touches is that one of the guys, Anthony Leveson, who belonged to this fraternity, he is mentioned in the 1511 agreement as being a master. He is still in London in 1537, and in 1537 he's busy petitioning Parliament to stop importing these Dutch hats. He doesn't want them. He's by this stage thoroughly, he thinks of himself as English. He doesn't want these imports. So they had once they, of course, were over here making these things, they must have felt extremely ambivalent about these hats coming in from overseas, and they didn't want them anymore. That's the way it goes.
Intriguing, but still banking on their Low Countries hat skills or innate hat skills. Bart, you had your hand up.
Yep, thank you, Lisbeth, and hi again, Mats. Thanks for an intriguing paper. You said quite a lot about the Dutch articles in the statutes, but what about the English articles? Because that would have been the English written by Dutch natives or possibly second-generation immigrants. And as you know, I've been working on a Dutchman who probably also wrote in English in the 1480s, and at that would have been like perfectly competent at it. So what about the English in the statutes? Is there anything that allows you to localize it somewhere? Was it competent somehow, or can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. No, and you must remind me after I've given the answer. You must remind me of the name again of this interesting Dutchman who you've been studying, who writes in Colchester, if I remember rightly, and writes in the same way as Scribe 2 does, if it is his own handwriting, in a beautiful English hand. The English is very good. I would regard it as there are slight differences between scribe 1 and 2, and they're very minor for again, and they are very it's sort of the things you would expect. They're all London dialect. So scribe 1 writes them, and scribe 2 writes them with an THEYM, but they're all perfectly plausible. The only interesting thing I think that gives them away that is a little and it's hard to know. Sorry, Bart, it's very hard to know sometimes whether a word which isn't attested. I mean, I've mentioned hat making, for instance, as a word that isn't actually isn't actually attested in English until it's found in these documents. And is that because they were influenced by hoedmaking, which is their own word for it? What I find often is that there are some first attested usages of things that become very common afterwards. So if anything, I think their English is a little innovative. But again, this is what linguists would expect. I mean, linguists think that and I think that linguistic innovation actually starts when with people who move about in different networks. They are the innovators. Now, linguistically speaking, the English is it's beautifully written. They know how to use, say, for example, even scribe 1, who isn't trained in England to write, but even he certainly knows how to abbreviate things in the English style, like with and how you abbreviate. He doesn't have any difficulty with English orthography, such as you sometimes do see that. Megan, the Dutch scribe who was active in England, did occasionally write stuff in English, and he sometimes makes mistakes, for example, as you would expect with things like th, thorns. You know, th, the th is not. That's not a phoneme in Dutch. So he shows he makes a few mistakes there. These guys don't. The bit that I initially thought maybe I should amend this, and maybe this is a th problem, is that instead of saying be lernet, unless he has learned, the scribe writes lerneth, th. But this again, when I've looked into these features, I find them to be, for example, the use of th for d is typical of Surrey, if you can map these things with a linguistic atlas. And whenever I've wanted to amend, I've found on reflection that this is just a peculiarity, which is actually plausibly explainable by thinking, well, that's where we are, aren't we? Pick these up in the Surrey dialect. So I find it to be completely plausible English, and very different from I have seen a lot of implausible English, which is Dutch inflected. Very ham-fisted translations of things in English, so literally that you can clearly see that this is a Dutchman at work. None of that in these statutes. Just fluent, sort of native competence, I would say.
Super. John, you've had your hand up.
Thank you. You described the production of the felt hats from the beaver fur, but am I right in thinking those were very much the sort of luxury end of the market, and most felt would be scraps of wool and cloth, which I think were known as flocks. And I wonder on that basis if that word that you were wondering about was from to be connected with flocking, adding flocks to the hats.
Oh, that's a lovely idea. I'll follow that up, and that may well be I'll see what I can do with that suggestion. You're absolutely right. The cheaper hats you can felt, of course, you can felt wool, and in the same way that you can felt the fur of the beaver, and this was the cheaper alternative. Apparently, it is not as good. It's not supposed to be as good as beaver fur, and no doubt, it's also a lot cheaper, and was probably the cheaper alternative. The hats that are imported are also of three kinds. There's the expensive, the top end, which is the beaver fur. At the lower end, there are straw hats which are imported, and the other type of hat that is imported is but which was, I think, actually also locally made, is the what they call the thrummed hat, with sort of shaggy, loose fibers coming out of it. It's really quite a sight. I think that was, again, those were also felt, but not made of beaver fur. But thanks very much for the suggestion of that flocks may be the word that I need to look at. I'll certainly follow that up. Thank you very much.
Learning a lot about both languages and hats. So Carol has got her hand up as well.
Thank you. Hello, Ad.
Hi.
Hi. I really enjoyed that. Thank you. I couldn't help thinking about that terrible atrocity that happened to the Flemings at St. Martin Vintry. Were they cloth makers, do you think? And what date would they have come over?
Yeah, well, the Flemings were yeah, there were a number of atrocities against Flemings, weren't there?
Yes.
They were big targets, and Sharon McSheffrey is in fact working on a book, I think, on the Evil May riots, where the Flemish suffered hugely. Yeah, there must have been a lot of rivalry, of course, because I think, you know, these guys could do things that and there was the usual thing, you know, they're taking our jobs. I have no idea what profession these Flemings were.
They wouldn't have been hat makers at that early period.
There's quite a lot. Yeah, well, there were quite a lot of quite a lot of Dutch craftsmen involved in the goldsmiths. I think they were big in, but yeah, quite a few at the high end. Yeah. Of course, I'm sure at the lower end too, you get them. I think there's no way of knowing from the general descriptions of these riots what they did for a living.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah.
But it's quite intriguing how many of these are like very, like the hats, that sounds like a very luxury trade kind of situation, and quite high up people, I would assume, involved in those networks. There was oh no, the chat has moved. There was a question about apprentices going back or not, whether you've got a sense of that.
Yes, there was one about apprentices, yeah.
It has moved. I had it specifically open to ask you. But so about moving back again, and whether how much of a sense you've got on that.
The Low Countries for apprentices, yeah.
Vanessa Cash.
Well, the statutes do envisage this kind of, I think the connections must have been kept going. And they did imagine influxes of new blood coming in as apprentices. In fact, it was a big source. This became one of the sources of contention with the haberdashers, who took them over. Who sort of took them over. The thing about the takeover from the haberdashers is that the haberdashers also, they specialized in fine accessories. And for the hat makers, the Dutch hat makers, the advantage must have been that it gave them retail opportunities that as aliens they wouldn't have had. It must have been easier, as it were, to sell their goods. They must have thought that was probably what was in it for them. But the big argument arose with about who controlled the quality and so on of these newcomers, and the haberdashers claimed that they were the guys who should vet the apprentices, but the hat makers probably quite rightly said, no, sorry, you're not competent in this matters. It's a matter of professional, we can judge who the right people are, and you shouldn't get involved. You cannot tell from these kinds of debates whether these were local, whether they were recruited from London, or whether the majority of these would have been from overseas. There's just no way of knowing. The statutes allow for both possibilities, whether they come from this side of the sea or from that side of the sea. That's always the way that's always the way things are phrased. The bit that I did notice when they get taken over by the haberdashers, the haberdashers agreement insist that English, or that local, I should say, that local apprentices should be chosen before aliens. That's something that comes in when they join the haberdashers. There's a kind of prejudicing now, only if you can't find anyone decent that is homegrown can you recruit from abroad. That comes in the haberdashers agreements. It's not there in the original statutes, which envisage local and overseas, and don't discriminate one way or the other.
That's so fascinating. That kind of maintaining, look, this is a field that crosses this channel, and it, in a way, it touches upon something that I think this is a very unfair question, because it might be more speculative than anything, but because of that continued connection, I was just curious why they keep that English in those statutes, because you've got the English and the Dutch, so you've got both, because it is such legalistic is not, but it's an official document. It is to establish the rights and the obligations, and you need the notaries to really confirm that. So that's the local, the English-speaking notaries, I assume, who don't necessarily then understand those Dutch paragraphs in between, or notice how different they are from some of those English ones. And so I was just curious why you keep that, because you've got the official establishment in the English paragraphs.
Yeah. You see what I think, and this is where I think my suggestions about the writing of these guys, that one of them has learned to write they're both Dutch speakers, right? But one of them has learned to write in England, and the other has learned to write abroad in Groningen or wherever he was. And then I think what we have to imagine is a kind of mixture of generations in these fraternities, that these statutes, by the way, were read out whenever the fraternity had their big events. The rule was that these statutes would be read out. They needed to be known. They also needed to be understood, of course, by everyone. Now, scribe number 2 drops Dutch. For the last 3 statutes, he doesn't translate. This scribe, I think, is actually it is a speculation. There's some evidence for it. That he is a second generation. And I think this kind of thing, where you must imagine a fraternity with different kinds of, it's the same with migrants now, first generation migrant, second generation, they're very different attitudes to language. One of the sweet things I just like to mention is that the word our for our fraternity, onze broederij, very sweet, only occurs ever in the Dutch. It's only in the Dutch that the first person pronoun plural, our fraternity, onze broederij, is used. In the English, it doesn't do that. A rather nice little touch.
Is that a practice between confraternities in Flanders? Do they use that language of our confraternity and the English don't within their English? Or
gosh, you know what? This may well be it. 'Cause, 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 'cause,
Sorry, that was just
No, that's
curiosity.
a really good suggestion. That's a really good suggestion. I'll follow it up. I'll check it. You know, you notice these things when you work very closely on a text, when you're editing it, you notice these tiny little details. And while I certainly have read many, you know, statutes just for points of comparison, I've never attended to that detail because I haven't been editing them, and I clearly should. It's a very good question.
Elsa, you've got your hand up.
You have extrapolated a little bit already on the going together of the Haberdashers and the Guild of St. James, and what escaped me was the date when this happened. So
the statutes are drawn up in 1501. The agreement between the Haberdashers and the hatmakers is 1511. 10 years later, they get sort of a kind of takeover, I think it is, and it wasn't altogether happy.
Yes, I was just wondering, but it's too early for it, whether the enforced takeover, if that's what it was, had something to do with perhaps the religious positioning of the incomers as opposed to the natives. But it's too early to worry about. I think.
No, we're still still very sort of pre-Reformation. And I think it was more a kind of the Haberdashers. Well, they wanted those fine hats. And they wanted, and of course the hat makers wanted to make it easy selling them. So there was something in it for both. In practice, I think it didn't really work out.
No.
I mean, when this guy Anthony Leveson petitions Parliament in 1537, saying that we shouldn't have imported hats, he doesn't say he doesn't associate himself with as a haberdasher at all. He's still a hat maker. He doesn't. So.
Well, we're galloping back to that protectionism, aren't we, at the moment?
Okay, Tracy Hill mentioned in the chat as well that the our company and our ordinance is ubiquitous in livery company documents in the later 16th century. So there will be.
Oh, excellent! So there is. I'll check a few from this date and see if that is so. And I mean, if it isn't, my suggestion, it's the kind of, I don't know, it's the kind of thing that the mother tongue may prompt.
Unless there are any urgent questions that people want to raise, I just want to say thank you again for a very interesting paper that clearly has raised a lot of interesting questions, and I think lots of us want to read about this further as well, and just that kind of entanglement between across the channel and those various layers of languages. So that's been really interesting, and thank you so much. And sorry we had to wait so long for you, like a year, but very glad we got to hear about it.